Hi, it's me again, and I thought we might continue looking at how to write a great science report, and the key to it is in choosing the variables we use in our activity. So, tell me, what is a variable? Well, vary means to change. So if we are going to change something, we first have to identify what we're going to change. In real world, we talk about things like how tall, what the shape is, and what the colour is. Now these would be normal variables, and we would use them in describing what happens. We might say during the activity, the plant became taller, or the shape of the flower changed over time, or the leaves went from being green to brown during the season. So that is why it becomes incredibly important to choose the right variable for our activity. There are three variables we need to consider. There is one that we decide we are going to change. Now this one is called the independent variable. It is the one we think will cause the change. So in our prediction, we should say that if we change this variable, something will happen. The second variable is the one we choose to measure. In other words, the independent will cause it to change. So we call this one the dependent variable. And we can measure it, and it should be easy to measure. There are so many variables, though, in our experiment, or possible variables, that we need to keep the rest the same or constant. Now, if we do this properly, we have what is called a fair test. In any fair test, we have one variable only that changes. We measure its effect on a second variable, and we keep all others the same. A very good way of doing this is to draw up this variables grid that I have shown here. Now what we do is we put the topic in the middle here. And then what we do is in each of the boxes around the outside, we put a series of things that allows us to decide what we think can possibly change. So all the things we can possibly change. So let's have a look at some general things that can change in science. In our science lab, we have used lots of chemicals, and the chemical can be in different forms. Is it a crystal? Is it a liquid? Is it a solid? Is it a powder? These things are what I mean by form, the form it takes. We should think about that because that is a variable. How much are we going to use? If we are talking about a gas or a liquid, we should use the word volume. If we are talking about a solid, we should use the word mass. The next question, what are we going to use to do our experiment? What container are we going to use? Are we using a test tube? Are we using a beaker? Are we using a flask? How big is it? These things must be decided upon. In many cases, this will be something we choose to keep the same. So it will be a controlled variable. Something that causes change and something that does change is the temperature. Now we can choose to change the temperature to see what happens to something, or we can measure the temperature change of something that's going on, of a reaction perhaps. So it can be either. We have to decide during this process to work out whether it's something we can measure. Now, another important one is time. How long are we going to do the activity for? How often are we going to make our measurements? So these two things here are a little bit linked, but I think we can see there are two different ideas. One is basically how long, the other is how often am I going to make the measurement? Am I going to do it every minute? Or will it only be after a certain amount of time? The last thing I want to talk about in chemicals in particular is the concentration. Now we know that the concentration is measured in m's. The larger the m, the more concentrated. So now I've got my table. What do? How do I choose? Well, I decide on something that I can change, and I must tell the reader how I'm going to change it. For example, am I going to measure, if I'm measuring time, choose to change time, am I changing and doing it every minute? If I'm changing mass, am I going to measure half a gram, then 1 gram, then 1.5 grams? What am I going to do with my changed variable? And this is important to tell the reader. It's also important to tell the reader when I choose my measured or dependent variable, how I'm going to measure it. If I'm going to measure a volume, I might measure it using a measuring cylinder. If I'm going to measure time, I would use a stopwatch. If I'm going to measure temperature, I could use a thermometer or maybe even a temperature probe. But you must tell the reader. And when I get to controlled variables, I should tell the reader at least 3 things I am going to keep the same. This is a simple way of telling the reader what's going on. And I would probably use a heading variables above this. So I can say independent, I am changing, and then list what you are changing. Don't forget to name it. Then you might tell me what you're measuring, or your dependent variable. I am measuring time using a stopwatch, or I am measuring volume using a measuring cylinder, or whatever. And the third thing you might like to tell me about is your controlled variables. Now be specific and name them. Most important. Alright, if you really want to show what's going on in terms of the control, I would use something like this. I will control. Now if I'm doing 3, I would name that as number 1. The volume of acid, you're telling me what you are controlling. I used by using a measuring cylinder, so you're telling me how. Here is what. Here is how. To make sure I use 20 cm cubed of acid every time. Look at the details. That's important. Right, last thing to look at is some traps and other mistakes. Please never use a calculated value as a variable. It just doesn't add up. Use variables. When in doubt, use a variable that is easily measured. Right? Don't confuse similar terms. A lot of people think that voltage and current are the same. If you talk to a lot of non-science people, they will use them and interchange them, and that's wrong. And probably most importantly, you are to use details. Be specific when you are describing things as much as possible.